I've been to more than 60 countries, but Portugal surprised me in a way I honestly didn't expect. Some moments on this trip were incredible, but at the same time, there were also things that didn't live up to the hype at all, and one specific moment almost ruined the entire experience for me. And if you're planning to visit Portugal, there are a few things I really wish I knew before coming here, because this country is not exactly what it looks like on social media. Before coming to Portugal, I had a very clear image in my mind. I thought it would be all about cheap prices, beautiful beaches, and that relaxed Southern European lifestyle. And honestly, that's exactly what most people expect. And yes, some of that is true, but once I actually experienced it, I realized the reality feels quite different, and in some moments completely unexpected. What surprised me the most is that Portugal doesn't feel like one destination. It feels like multiple completely different trips combined into one, and that's where things started to get interesting for me. My trip started in Porto, and honestly, this was the place that made the strongest impression on me right away. There was something about the atmosphere, especially around the Douro River, that just felt real and authentic. And watching the sunset, there was one of those moments where you just stop and take everything in. But then I went to Aveiro, which is often called the Venice of Portugal, and this is where my expectations didn't really match reality. It's nice, but it didn't feel as special as I imagined, and this was the first time I felt that gap between expectation and reality. Lisbon, on the other hand, felt completely different. It's bigger, more chaotic, but also much more alive, and walking through neighborhoods like Alfama and Bairro Alto felt like exploring different worlds within the same city. Then there was Sintra, which honestly felt like stepping into a fairy tale, with its colorful palaces and green landscapes that almost don't feel real. Close to Sintra, I also visited Cascais, which was a nice coastal escape, although more crowded than I expected. But the moment that really changed everything for me was visiting the Benagil Caves. Seeing that cave from inside with the sunlight coming through the top felt unreal. But this is also where things could easily go wrong if you don't time it properly. And I didn't realize that until it was almost too late. And then there were places like Faro and Portimão, which were okay, but after seeing places like Benagil, they honestly felt like the most underwhelming part of my trip. One thing I realized very quickly in Portugal is that some of the best experiences are actually very simple. In Porto, just sitting by the river and watching the atmosphere around me turned out to be one of my favorite moments. In Lisbon, getting on those old trams, walking through narrow streets, and stopping at viewpoints along the way made the whole experience feel very dynamic. I also found myself trying pastéis de nata from different bakeries almost every day, and it somehow became part of my routine. One of the most unforgettable experiences was the boat tour inside the Benagil Cave, but this is also where that moment I mentioned earlier almost ruined the experience for me. I went at the wrong time. It was extremely crowded. There were at least 20 to 30 boats inside the cave at the same time, people shouting, cameras everywhere, and for a few minutes, it honestly felt chaotic and nothing like the peaceful scene I had imagined. Exploring Sintra was another highlight, especially walking around the palaces and gardens, which felt completely different from anywhere else I've been. And honestly, some of the best moments on this trip were not planned at all. They just happened while I was exploring, eating at local restaurants, or simply walking around without a strict plan. If I had to do this trip again, I would definitely change the way I planned it. I would still start in Porto, then move to Lisbon, and finish the trip in the Algarve region, but I would slow everything down because at some point, I honestly felt a bit overwhelmed and rushed. Looking back, the best moments of this trip didn't come from trying to see as much as possible. They came from actually taking the time to enjoy each place, and that's something I would do very differently next time. For this trip, I decided to rent a car, and for the route I followed, it was definitely the right decision. Driving between cities was very easy, and it gave me the flexibility to explore places like Sintra, Cascais, and especially the Algarve. But inside cities like Lisbon and Porto, I almost never used it because walking, Uber, and public transport were much more practical. Parking in city centers can also be tricky, and this is where things can quickly become stressful if you're not prepared. So if I did it again, I would still rent a car for flexibility, but I would avoid using it inside the cities as much as possible to avoid unnecessary stress. For my trip, I stayed in both Porto and Lisbon, and I think this was the perfect strategy, especially for a first visit. Porto felt more compact and relaxed, while Lisbon offered more variety and energy, so they balanced each other really well. But what really made a difference for me was staying in central areas, especially in Lisbon, because it completely changed how I experienced the city. Instead of wasting time on transport, I could just walk out and immediately start exploring different neighborhoods, and that made the whole trip feel much smoother and more enjoyable. If I planned this trip again, I would still use these two cities as my main bases and take day trips from there, because this setup not only saved time, but also made the entire experience feel much more relaxed. Before coming to Portugal, I was really curious about how expensive it would be, and honestly, this is where Portugal surprised me the most. It's not as cheap as many people think, but at the same time, it's still quite reasonable compared to other Western European destinations. I stayed in 5-star hotels in Porto and Lisbon, rented a car, and ate out regularly, and overall, I felt like I was getting very good value for what I paid. Food was quite affordable, with lunches usually costing around 15 to 20 euros, while dinners were slightly more expensive, often around 25 to 30 euros, but still reasonable for the quality you get. Transportation costs were also manageable, especially with Uber and Bolt, where short rides in the city usually cost around 4 to 5 euros, which made getting around very easy. However, activities and entrance fees can add up quickly, especially in places like Sintra, which is something you should definitely keep in mind. So overall, I would say Portugal is not exactly a budget destination, but it offers great value if you plan it properly. One thing I didn't expect before coming here was how much I would enjoy the food. Pastéis de nata became something I had almost every day, and I genuinely never got tired of it. Seafood is a big part of Portuguese cuisine, and I found it to be fresh, simple, and very satisfying. I also really enjoyed the cafe culture, where you can sit down, have a coffee for a very low price, and just take a short break. Overall, the food felt uncomplicated but very enjoyable, and it was definitely one of the highlights of my trip. The biggest mistake I made on this trip was trying to fit too many places into a short amount of time, and at one point, it honestly started to feel exhausting. And I even caught myself thinking I should have planned this trip completely differently. Even though I managed to see a lot, it turned the whole experience into something much more rushed than I expected, and I didn't always have enough time to actually enjoy each place. Another thing I realized is that not every destination will impress you equally, and after seeing places like Benagil or Sintra, some spots just felt underwhelming, even if they're popular. Using a car inside cities like Lisbon and Porto can also make things more stressful than necessary, because walking and Uber are simply easier and faster. Timing is another key factor, especially for popular places, where going at the wrong time can completely change your experience, like it did for me in Benagil. And finally, I really underestimated how much walking I would do, especially in Lisbon, which is much hillier than it looks, and that can easily catch you off guard if you're not prepared. If you're planning a trip to Portugal, one of the most important things is to plan your days carefully, especially if you have limited time. Start early when visiting popular places like Sintra or Benagil, because it makes a huge difference in avoiding crowds. Avoid using a car inside major cities, and instead rely on walking or Uber whenever possible. If you do rent a car, always check parking options in advance, because it can save you a lot of time and stress. Try to keep your itinerary flexible, because some of the best experiences happen when you don't follow a strict plan. And most importantly, don't rush the trip, because Portugal is a place you enjoy much more when you slow down. So, is Portugal worth visiting? Honestly, yes, but not in the way I expected before coming here. Some places will completely exceed your expectations, while others might feel a bit underwhelming, and that contrast is something you should be ready for. But overall, it's the variety of experiences that makes Portugal special. From cities like Porto and Lisbon to places like Sintra and Benagil, you get a lot in a relatively short distance. And if you plan it right, it can easily become one of the most memorable trips you've had. That was my Portugal experience, and honestly I'm really glad I finally got to see this country for myself. If you're planning your own trip and you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll see you in the next travel story.